So, good morning, everyone. My name is Anne-Sophie, and I'm a future PhD candidate here at the American Studies Department. And I have the pleasure to chair this very first panel today, titled Lyrical Encounters with Irish Animals. And we have two very exciting talks, and naturally also two very exciting presenters for this here, which are Dr. Jessica Bundschuh from the University of Stuttgart and Dr. Eóin Flannery from the University of Limerick. So thank you for being here. And while you're no doubt more than ready to just get into it, I also want to give a brief introduction of these two speakers, starting with Dr. Jessica Bundschuh, and followed by her talk. And afterwards, we'll proceed in the same manner with Dr. Eóin Flannery. So, Jessica Bundschuh is a lecturer in English literature and cultures at the University of Stuttgart, and her research interests lie in the field of contemporary Irish poetry, contemporary poetics, and performances and British Romanticism, among others. Her publications have appeared in multiple journals, such as Review of Irish Studies, in Europe, Études Irlandaises, Ecozone, Poetics Today, the Paris Review, and Ephesus, with a chapter on Irish poetry and performance in a 2023 volume on poetic forms. She has a PhD in English literature and creative writing from the University of Houston and an MFA in creative writing from the University of Maryland. Her current research project is on the Irish prose poem, which is, of course, also reflected in her talk today, where she will be focusing on a poetry collection by Eamon Grennan. That's it from my side, and I suggest that we're ready for your talk now. I just want to point out that you basically keep all the questions that arise from this talk within, and because after both of these talks, we'll have a discussion both. Basically, so I think that.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers. Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for the introduction. And thanks for letting poetry not be always the one at the end of the workshop. It's such a gift. It's such a gift. So today, and it feels like just a beautiful extension from the talk this morning to also think about hopeful ways of reading eco-relationships. So here is Enchanted Encounters with Eamon Grennan's Double Life Creatures in Plainchant. Poet Martina Evans, as curator for Poetry Day Ireland in 2023, chose the theme of Message in a Bottle, inspired by Paul Celan's famous speech from 1958 that he delivered upon receiving a literature prize in Bremen. Paul Celan's idea of a poem as a message in a bottle reminds us that no poem is an island. It needs a reader to complete the process. Poems are waiting for the reader to uncork the bottle. Evans refers here to Celan's assertion that a poem, as a manifestation of language, is thus essentially a dialogue. Poems in this sense, too, are underway. They are making towards something. With this selection, Poetry Day Ireland enacts its own theme by drawing inspiration from elsewhere. Jane Robinson, as part of the organizing committee, further materializes Celan's presence with the challenge she issued to the Irish public to mail in bottles to Poetry Ireland's offices in Dublin that capture in miniature a local climate as a ceremonial wish to stop damaging the Earth's climate and biodiversity. This this theme of message in a bottle is a useful segue in my topic today for two reasons. First, Eamon Grennan likewise welcomes Celan into his Irish landscape. Second, the image of a brief message speaks to the genre of the prose poem, which miniaturizes a larger narrative such that its brevity is critical to how it makes meaning. In this way, it is the literary form that most resembles a still photograph. As a snapshot, it provides a mere fragment or momentary evocation of a scene or set of circumstances. Tellingly, Grennan draws his epigraph for Plainchant from Ceylon's poem, How You, to highlight the sense of capturing a brief snapshot. You're there with a splinter of life. The volume is driven by this desire to sync up with another in crystallized snippets of time, and as a genre built on the visuality of textual boxes like little splinters. The prose poem recalls the daguerreotype. It is worth noting that the emergence of Baudelaire's invention of the genre in Paris corresponds with the invention of photography. As we see from covers of two different editions of Plainchant, the focus is on interactions with animals, and the setting on the coast of Connemara, we heard a bit about in Moyer's lovely poems last night, becomes a backdrop, not a foreground. These encounters with human subjects, from hares, seals, mares, cows, lambs, to butterflies, wasps, spiders, ticks, ants, and houseflies, lead to unpredictable multi-species partnerships. Grennan populates his volume with a cast of companion species dominated by an abundance of coastal birds, larks, starlings, sparrows, swallows, and sand martins, which demonstrate an otherworldly sensitivity for their environment. As the title Plainchant suggests, Grennan merges here plain and everyday speech with a Joycean epiphany or chant akin to birdsong. In one isolated rendezvous after another, this community of double-life creatures emerges fleetingly from Grennan's narrow column of poetic prose with justified margins that vary in response to the first line, such that the idiosyncratic motions of each non-human companion in the real world determine the poem's topography. As one sees here from the marketing copy, as you see from Gallery Press, it does not identify the volume as containing prose poems at all, making note only of their justified margin format, likely due to the fact that the prose poem has had a bad rap of lacking musicality. So true. This, though, is not true of Plainchant. Rather, Grennan's one-on-one lyrical encounters project a mood of enchantment, a quality Rita Felsky celebrates in uses of literature as soaked through with an unusual intensity of perception and effect to offer rapturous self-forgetting rather than self-shattering. Herein, subjects given to, as she says, a blurred sense of autonomy and control that often, as we'll see in a moment, transforms into a triadic dialogue in the company of fellow poets, like Elizabeth Bishop alongside seals and Robert Frost alongside deer. Aside from the epigraph, Ceylon too joins as the co-witness to, we've heard already about blackbirds, wrens, finches, and ants. And ultimately, Grennan's doubly observed non-human companions model for readers a practice of intoxicating enchantment that heightens the present moment. The first poem in Grennan's sequence after the Ceylon epigraph is aptly titled Encounter. Indeed, the hybrid genre of the prose poem is well suited to the complexity of such encounters intended for multi-species relativity, entangled relations, and reordered hierarchies. It is here that subjects are pulled into what Deborah Bird-Rose calls ecological erotics, dominated by a physical longing to reach out and enter and discover mutuality in an ongoing recursive connectivities of the living world. In fact, it is the agility and speed and undeniable sense of agency of Grennan's non-human subjects that sets off this state of ecological erotics in Plainchant. Here, in Encounter, the human speakers with hearts still singing channel Joyce to pack away within the brevity of the mini suitcase form of a prose poem, plain words to be taken out at times of need, the stop, the suddenness, the coming and going. These charged encounters utterly transform the way the speaker sees the surrounding ecosystem. After the rapid departure of the hare, the sea and the sky become a site of artistic creation, like a rib dish of green and blue blown glass. Thus, the hare and the hare's swerving departure transforms the speaker's perception of Connemara into an aesthetic euphoria worthy of blown glass, a fittingly transparent materiality to suit the the poem's final word of invisibility. Grennan's multi-species encounters follow, we already heard her mentioned last night, I bet we'll hear her mentioned a lot in the next few days, Donna Haraway's contention that we are in a knot of species co-shaping all the way down. Response and respect are possible only in these knots with actual animals and people looking back at each other. Visuality and looking, a sense that also dominates the genre of the ode, and a plainchant too has an ode at quality, is a defining marker of these encounters. Above all, Grennan avoids a one-sided act of looking, since the hare, gendered male here, occupies the role of active witness to his surroundings. Notice the frequent references to the ocular organ of the hare, from his basalt black burning eyes to his two onyx bright live ready for anything eyes, or his two quick, bright, almost perfect knowing eyes. The hare's acute sense of sight and his ability to obscure the sight of others by becoming invisible at will not only protects him from harm, this capacity also signals agency, such that Grennan's embodied lyricism of knotted and muddled encounters between human and non-human subjects are reciprocal. Ultimately, it is the speedy hare who is in control of his space, able to swerve in and out of a topography within the brief arc of the prose poem. In contrast, the observing speaker is intentionally static and passive, where I try to stand still as a post. Thus, the hare not only negotiates the spatiality of a green field, which replicates the spatial experience of reading these columnar prose poems on a white page, he makes the textual and geographical borders fluid and transitional, initiating a dash beneath the barbed wire fence, all headlong, leg-elbowed in and out of Fogarty's near field. These multi-species references in Encounter to the motion of swerving towards and away productively calls forth Lucretius's theory of Kleinemann, or swerve, on the nature of things, long valued by scientists, philosophers, and literary critics. Michel Serres, in The Birth of Physics, for instance, explains that physics is concerned with weight, heat, and fluids, and thereby with falling and flow, which necessitates a slope or deviation. Kleinemann produces just this inclined path that results in a fluctuation and thereby a connection. Similarly, Jane Bennett in Vibrant Matter contends that this primordial swerve, ideal for Grennan's poems of walking and pedicis, or leaping like a hare, illustrates how the world is not determined, but rather that change is possible, and that any actant's efficacy necessitates the interactive interference of many bodies and many forces. We heard this mentioned also last night, Anthropocene Poetics, David Farrar devotes a whole chapter to Lucretius's clustering motion of individual atoms. He argues that the impulse of kinship in this archetypal dynamic of collisions must equally acknowledge and accommodate the turning away or fleeing from contact, like in Grennan's encounter between the speaker and the hare. Thus, those participating in the turbulence of swerve retain their own integrity. Quote, as they turn into one another's path, they become diverted into a new path. Further, the briefness and accelerated parting that characterize these entanglements does not undermine their value. In fact, it heightens them, since they become soaked in longing and memory. That is, as Farrar asserts, in striking one another, by inclining toward one another, they collaborate in the performance of the soundscape, appealing harmony that layers wave upon reverberating wave, each new swerve adding to the rich effect. And this swerve is the necessary turn or deviation that tangles life in knots of kin-making. These lyrical knots become more significant when Grennan expands the circle. Obviously, the scope includes readers on multiple continents in an Irish and American edition. Before that, though, Grennan has already expanded his aperture to welcome fellow poets into his swerving tangles, and thereby he rescales his columnar prose poems to accommodate a larger community of subjects that includes poets and animals. Critically, Grennan presents his non-human subjects as fellow crafters or makers. A value here is Aaron Moe's assertion that zoopoetics is the process of discovering innovative breakthroughs in form through an attentiveness. Attentiveness, of course, is very important for policy law too, an attentiveness to other species' bodily poesis. That is, it focuses on the process by which animals make texts. They gesture, they vocalize. The sounds and vocalizations emerge from a rhetorical body, a poetic body, or rather a body that is able to make. Similarly, Timothy Morton contends that each individual needs to be tuned in to recognize fellow makers, since in experiencing beauty, one coexists with at least one thing that isn't the self. In this regard, it is a matter of recalibrating oneself to recognize the creativity in other symbiotic beings. As Morton says simply, you don't have to be ecological because you are ecological. It's already there if we care to see it. We've already heard exactly that sentiment. Appreciating animal subjects who gesture and vocalize is critical and vital to Grennan's project. In Seals off the White Strand, Renville, Grennan witnesses 3 seals, small, slick domes with lava black eyeballs, the brows barely skimming the surface. The speaker wonders, in a parenthetical aside, mimicking here Bishop in the move of offhanded witnessing, if he should, in parentheses there, like Bishop on the rocky shore of Maine, sing to them. He distinguishes his desire to sing from Bishop's Baptist hymns, preferring a song from this side of the same ocean. Grennan's speaker imagines if he were to sing an Irish tune to Irish seals, the seals might lift in species sympathy for Bishop seals from the mid-1940s. Each in their own, and this is beautiful, their own high amphibian melancholy, with a voice freed in our unhindered air in an extended call and response pattern. Surely Bishop's use of the second person future conditional address calls out to Grennan to finish the action she began. As she said, if you should dip your hand in, your wrist would ache immediately. Thus, Grennan swerves into Bishop the way he swerves into his observed seals with whom he does not make music. Instead, they mutually witness each other. In the end, I just stood and stared at those 3 pitch-eyed, salt-slick hound heads gazing, unblinking, back at me as if waiting patiently for something, anything in either world to happen. Here, Grennan's citational practice of engaging Bishop's repeated line, cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear, brings human and non-human worlds together to cultivate a vast temporal and spatial kinship. As fellow makers, these animal subjects become aligned with poets and poets with them across time and context. Tom Van Doren claims that each species lineage embodies characteristics that are passed between generations in an ongoing intergenerational process of becoming that relies on the tireless work of survival, adaptation, and transformation, built on the imperfect relationships of inheritance, nourishment, and care. This intergenerational care flourishes not only between species lineages, it likewise upholds poet lineages. That is, Grennan relies in his approach upon a long tradition of poets before him. For instance, Grennan's Two Walking recalls Robert Frost's To Look at Two, a poem of ecological erotics in which a buck and a doe look at the speaker and his female companion, 2 sets of lovers on either side of the wall, each engaged in Haraway's advocacy of looking Who had seen too, whichever side you spoke from. In a 1998 interview, Grennan concedes how important Frost was, so much so that he had to submerge, as he said, Frost's work because Frost has such a powerful voice. Grennan, though, freely minds Frost's instruction to avoid portrayals of nature that become, quote, sermons in stones, and rather, as he says, press at what you're actually seeing as a human being so that it relates to your life without destroying its own independence and integrity. In Grennan's Two Walking, the speaker and his companion see how all is alight, as a pulse running wild with its own delighted sense. It's a now, a here. And what is here and now is not only Frost's transgenerational lesson in looking, but also the immediacy of shorn lambs perched on their grass-green patches to remain a solid presence in response to our gaze with their anonymous burly there-ness, their weight and great bulk a kind of terminus. The here and the now, thus, includes the there and the gone. Aside from fostering a transgenerational collaboration aimed to protect a poetic lineage, Grennan's reliance on fellow poets is a tactic that also strengthens his Lucretian swerve. That is, if Grennan desires to create a poetics that takes on the challenge of loving those creatures that seem to withdraw from or resist relation, he discovers a solution in citation, beginning with the Ciaran epigraph and followed by numerous poems that incorporate a snippet of poetry to initiate a chain of contiguous relations and provide a framework for thinking about an intentional turn toward the non-human life that is also a turn back to the newly strange self. In closing, I wish to quickly highlight 3 Ciaran sightings in which the citations create a shadow world hovering, like in Snatched, behind animals witnessed in passing as little secrets in Ciaran's vernacular. Here, a finch catches a breeze and swerves in and out of the frame, is gone, is back, is gone, and then a wren enters, and they form a brief community. The lot of us shivers in the grip of time. Similarly, in Singer and Storm, we have another Grennan Ciaran swerve, now in the company of a blackbird. Ciaran's excerpt reads like a direct address. Your question, your answer, your song, what does it know? To Grennan's blackbird, a font of knowledge and maker of music, I'm struck by the simple endurance of the small heart that composes its own song and lets it out through the tiny open passage of its throat and golden bill as if it were a song of praise, a praise song absolute and abiding. The speaker acknowledges the birdsong's double life of stress and song, for the blackbird is a pragmatic artist on the hunt for real sustenance, with instinct and habit directing each of his quick food-seeking hops. And finally, the most on-the-nose example of aligning a Lucretian swerve with zoo poetics appears in With Ant and Ciaran. I wondered why an ant crawling across the speaker's open book of Ciaran's work would be the creature selected to sniff the ins and outs of a Ciaran lyric beloved on the account of its final 2 lines, which address the paradoxical project of Plainchant, namely to both ground and elevate the speaker. Schwer werden, leichter sein. Grow more heavy, be more light. I will concede to you that these lines appear, and you see, here's even a picture of it, in a postcard that I have positioned above my writing desk as inspiration. And this is exactly what Grennan does here by conjoining Ciaran with an ant who touches the curlicues of his black letters in German, Sprache, then swerves into English, language. This is a space of doubles and pairs. Mitstern, partner star, or co-earth, Nebenerde, fellow planet, earth neighbor. The ant and Ciaran, each situated on one side of a typographic field, are linguistic and physical doubles. That is, I realized suddenly why ant is Ciaran's perfect insect counterpart. Paul Celan's birth name, after all, as you all maybe likely know, is Anshul, ant shell. Here we see Grennan playfully drawing his Irish ant into the typographic pun, while the ant searches for nourishment of anything it could translate, now a double of Grennan too. I hope this exploration of Plainchant has been persuasive in putting forth the playful evocation of enchantment as one means, among many others that we'll hear over the days of the symposium, to establish a lasting kinship of non-human subjects on whose swerve we are already riding. Thank you very much.
So first of all, thank you very much for this very fascinating talk. I certainly gained a lot of insights on the form of the prose poem and everything that it can entail. And yeah, thank you for that. And I now have the pleasure to present our second speaker for this panel, Dr. Eóin Flannery, who is an associate professor of English literature in the Department of English Language and Culture and Literature at Mary Immaculate College, University of Limerick. He was also the Peter O'Brien Visiting Scholar in Canadian Irish Studies at Concordia University in Montreal in 2022, and his primary interests are in the environmental humanities, post-colonial studies, and world literatures, and he published extensively on poetry and fiction in the post-Celtic Tiger era. He has published over 60 scholarly articles and book chapters, and he is the author of 5 books himself, of which the most recent ones, the 3 most recent ones are Form, Effect, and Debt in Post-Celtic Tiger Fiction, Ireland in Eco-Criticism, Literature, History, and Environmental Justice in 2016, and in 2011, Calder McCann and the Aesthetics of Redemption. He has edited special themed issues of journals such as the Journal of Eco-Criticism, Postcolonial Texts in Irish Studies Review. And his current research projects include a study of the career and work of Eugene McCabe, a book entitled Sounding the Contemporary in Irish Poetry, and with Eugene O'Brien, a co-edited volume of Études irlandaises on contemporary Irish poetics. So, without further ado, I suggest we move on to your talk. And once again, try to remember your questions, both from your talk and how the questions that arise from this talk.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Sorry, I'm just in the process of breaking the laptop here. So. Okay, so yeah, my German is ropey at best. So. Junior Sir John. Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, for the very nice introduction, and thanks to Maureen and the other organisers for facilitating this discussion, this series of discussions, I suppose. Just to reiterate what Jessica said, it's great to have a kind of forum for poetry, and particularly what seems to have turned into a poetic aviary this morning. We've had birds. I'm going to talk about birds as well over the course of the talk. And I'm going to, as you'll see, recycle and repurpose Donna Haraway as well, as Jessica alluded to. So this morning, I'm going to look at the work of Ciaran Berry, but I'm going to start with Donna Haraway, and again, to go back to her 2007 book, When Species Meet, which deals with the long-standing problems raised by myths of human exceptionalism, what I suppose Val Plumwood might call human exceptionalism. Eschewing the blunt dualisms that have contoured much rationalist thought and underpin historical and extant sociocultural hierarchies, Haraway insists that all mortal beings live in and through the use of one another's bodies, and we'll see that as a kind of keynote in a couple of poems I'm going to look at in due course. The ferocities implicit in Haraway's arguments span the physical and the affective as she alights upon a host of exploitation across species boundaries, and rather persist in accepting the perpetuation of ethically neutered objectifications of non-human species, Haraway demands we acknowledge the dignity, of course, of the latter. And in this context, or in the context of her aforementioned point on the deeply historical and deeply embedded mutualities of the human and the non-human, that her work seems to strike a useful initial keynote to analyses of contemporary Irish poetry, and specifically, they said, Ciaran Berry, whose work may not be familiar to you. I'm going to kind of take I suppose, what might be called a deep dive into two of his poems. So the doors are locked, you can't escape. His work is, I suppose, it's deeply personal in many respects. And in many cases, it's rooted in specific recollected moments of interaction with the natural world across a number of years and a lifetime, really. But this doesn't lapse into static sentimentality. Rather, his work acknowledges the distances between representation and reality, while remaining aware of the indelible links between human and non-human ecologies. And his work is remarkably associative, as Berry explores nature as both content of and catalyst for personal memory, with the personal and the so-called natural perennially shadowed by decline and death. Drawing upon historical characters and events such as Charles Darwin, most notably, Berry's work touches upon the violence of imperial histories as they leave sundered and exploited landscapes in their wake. And these are some of his three collections thus far: The Sphere of Birds, which I'm going to concentrate on, The Dead Zoo, which kind of speaks for itself in terms of animal poetics, and most recently, Liner Notes. So he draws attention also to the domesticated legacies of these histories of imperialism in the forms of natural history museums, as we see in his second collection, which in the context of the poem, The Written Word, prompt us to consider the power dynamics at play in both as forms of exhibition and representation. As I said, I'm going to look at the Sphere of Birds. I'm a big fan of Berry's work, but again, to go back to Jessica's talk, don't take my word for it. Eamon Grennan is a big fan as well. And Grennan says that what he describes in reviewing, this is The Sphere of Birds, what an astonishing feel for language Berry has, physical fact and ramifying thought these poems show. Nothing seemed lost in Ciaran Berry's quick eye, nor too rich or subtle for his quickening tongue. He generates image after striking image in a language of peculiar immediacy, thoughtful, sensuous, and with the remarkable confidence of rhythmic control. I think he's onto something there. Now, I'm going to look at, first one I'm going to look at is Cold Pastoral, and they're my jottings there. I was too lazy to type the whole poem out, so I said I'd just take a picture and put it up on a slideshow to prove that I actually had read it. Luckily, my writing is fairly illegible, so I'm married to a doctor, so I've kind of imbibed some of that inability to write clearly. But in an essay on Thomas Hardy, the eco-critical scholar Richard Kerridge refers to crowded landscapes. These 2 poems, sorry, this is for the birds I'm going to look at again. More scratchings there on the page. But Kerridge, in this edited book, Beyond Nature Writing, talks about crowded landscapes in which there are residues and traces of deep historical human and non-human ecological interdependence and interpenetration. And Berry's debut, as shown there, The Sphere of Birds, is prefaced by a Petrarchan sonnet entitled Cold Pastoral. Obviously it draws on a particular literary tradition. The title itself is taken from Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. See it there in the centre, Cold Pastoral. And the poem, as I said, is styled as a Petrarchan sonnet. It hints at the mutuality of the human and the non-human. The tone of Berry's prefatory poem, it sort of stands outside the main collection, is evident from its titular invocation of a desolate iteration of pastoral lyricism, a lyric trope that is singularly entrenched in Western culture, according to Greg Gard, who also says it's deeply problematic for environmentalism. Now, in Berry's deft hands, the pastoral is marbled with Gothic effects, while at the same time tending towards a lyric realism in its attentiveness to the bare exigencies of agricultural labour. Thus, at one level, there seems to be an ironisation of the burnished aesthetics of the pastoral poetic tradition, a suggestion made plain in the starkness of the opening 2 lines of the poem, which I have facilitated here in much more legible and viewer-friendly fashion. A crow shot dead and hung from a steel pole warns other crows away from a field of grain. The bleak indexical warning of the avian carcass admits of the enduring and asymmetrical violence of human and non-human relations. But the very fact of its apparent indexicality confirms the bonds of sustaining mutuality across species boundaries. The signifier might well be rendered as a rotting organic remnant, but it remains expressive. And while it cannot be gainsaid that the carcass embodies an articulacy suffused with violence, there's also recognition of the possibility of cross-species communication. The context of seasonal agricultural labour is suggestive of ecological cyclicality, which from one point necessitates knowledge of and sensitivity towards the growth patterns of non-human nature. Yet this is a point of ambivalence registered by Berry, as the husbandry of farming reduces the landscape to functionalism and associated violence of humanity's needs. This ambivalence is not exclusively signalled by Berry in terms of the invocation of the external physicalities of human and non-human interdependence, but is also palpable at the level of poetic form in Cold Pastoral. Though patterned, as I said, as a Petrarchan sonnet, Cold Pastoral does not rigidly adhere to the most familiar features of the form. While it retains the verse structure of octet and sestet, Berry's rhyme scheme deviates from those commonly associated with the sonnet form. The octet furnishes a graphic depiction of the gradual decomposition of the crow, as Berry scores his representation of the decaying bird with oral poetic flourishes. And this is plainly seen in the alliterative concluding line of the octet, where our attention is drawn to the blood that's bloomed above the wound's neat hole. There are implicit tensions here, as both verb and adjective apparently contradict the violence of the fatal gunshot, as if the oral register of the gun's discharge is muted by the resonance of the affirmative alliteration. Yet equally, the symmetry of the wound compounds the ostensible neatness of the larger poetic form in which it is housed. Yet at all stages of the octet, and despite such yearning for balance and composure, we are unable to ignore the brittle and broken remainders of the bird. Yet integrity and solidity of form are realistic goals. If they are, realistic goals at the level of poetic composition, they are less viable or sustainable beyond the poetry and the terrain surveyed by Berry's poetic speaker. And such sentiments are rendered in the spare opening to the sestet, when an apparent reference to the decaying bird, poetic voice declares, "Things weather fast here. Soon bird will be bone." Again, we bones mentioned this morning as well, didn't we? However, given the imprints of humanity both in the poem and in the deliberate formal contouring of the poem, we can intuit a broader set of implications for this statement. In other words, it is not just the bird that will inevitably atrophy beyond recognition, as the indexical bond forged earlier in the poem assures us of a deeper mutuality across species here. The carcass might well function as a prop in the subsistence economy of these rural environments, contributing to the sustenance of physical and financial well-being, but it is also a harbinger of universal mortality. Just to remind you of the poem again. The poise offered by Berry's deployment of the sonnet form is not an exercise in anthropocentric objectification. As we just noted, the retention of the verse structure is abetted by a similar retention of a Volta-like moment of wider philosophical recognition at the outset of the sestet. And when we turn our attention to the poem's rhyme scheme, it is possible to divine an equal awareness of the organic cyclicality highlighted earlier. Both octet and sestet are arranged in an A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A rhyme schemes. And while they deviate in terms of diction, Berry establishes mirroring, echoing effects across the two stanzas. Such a schematic arrangement of end rhymes might be called chiastic, given that it works its way back to the original end rhyme sound effect over the duration of the stanza. Thus, we can read such a formal arrangement as reversal, repetition, or indeed as a further incarnation of the thematic cyclicality on view elsewhere in the poem. And this cyclicality is freighted with ambivalence because of the ways in which the human and the non-human relations exist in a tenuous balance between life and death in the poem. This mutual but ambivalent connectedness is further evinced in the Hornung. Berry refers to a fat gull's fractured keen that cuts through stone. Again, there's an apparent disharmony here, with the dissonance of the isolated gull's cry straining against the assonant O sounds of the poem's final word, stone. The latter is a fraction of the dominant sound effect of the entire poem, as both octet and sestet begin and end, respectively, with pole, hole, bone, stone. Indeed, these framing end rhymes echo the initial assonance of the poem's title. engendering a sense of integrity and closure to the oral architecture of cold pastoral. But this would be to bestow an unwarranted degree of anthropocentric agency within the drama of the poem. And Berry confounds such a mistaken assumption by the fact that the assonant O sound effect that punctuates key parts of the poem actually coheres with the physical enunciation of a funereal keen. The lamentation at the end of the poem is afforded to the non-human, but via the formal practice attached to the death rituals of humanity. There's no facile collapse of humanity and non-humanity into each other in cold pastoral, nor is there any detour taken into a cloying romanticism about multi-species coexistence. Rather, Berry solicits the reader to accept and to acknowledge the inherent mutuality of the human and the non-human, as well as the trans-historical interconnectedness that is necessary, but is also coloured by violence and existential threat. Now, we move on to even more cheery stuff for the birds, right? So this is for the birds. I'm not going to go through it line by line, obviously. The carcass encountered at the outset for the birds has presumably been set upon by a non-human predator. So this is never established, and the animal is now just carrion on the sand dunes. At first, then, we are left with nothing more than a documentary outline of this carcass. Something has pried open the body of this hare, unpicked a seam from between the stilled hind legs to the middle of the slackened grey belly. Now the two sides of the wound part slowly, like a mouth widening as it comes on the right word. There is a surgical precision suggested here in the violence inflicted upon the anatomy of the hare, a violence no doubt underwritten by a carnivorous desire, concern to which the poem returns in due course. This is the bruteness of survival. It is not sentimentalized in any way here by Berry, but it is gradually intruded upon by humanity. The unvarnished portrait of the hare's wounded carcass gives way then to the similate entry of the human in poetic form and content. Berry invokes language with the use of figurative language. In this instance, the poem attends to oral expression, and the embodied performance of speech is figuratively linked to the ravaged body of the slain hare. This reprises, as we see elsewhere in Berry's work, his interest in the exertions of the human body. But in For the Birds, Berry is more concerned with the porosities and commonalities that exist across species. And the significance of both the early placement of the simile in the poem and its alignment of human verbal expression with predatory violence cannot be underestimated, given similar patterns in other works in the sphere of birds. The simile is legible as a thematic keynote. It is a self-conscious index of this poem's and Berry's concern with, as we've established, linguistic representation, human violence, and the non-human. However, it needs to be stressed that such features of Berry's works are never outright and simplistic disavowals of anthropocentric cultural assertions or exercises. Poetic figuration blends into ekphrasis in a further meditation on the ethics and politics of verbal and visual representation. The first tercet focuses exclusively on the hare's carcass, unblemished by any human presence, and is grammatically self-contained. Once the poem reaches the second tercet, the poem's lines and tercets no longer define the limits of its sentences, as they cascade in their respective ambivalent associations between humanity and non-humanity. Breaking from the rigour of the opening tercet's singular attentiveness to the deceased hare, For the Birds performs cross-species connection in its shape and in its associative contents. In this respect, it is worth returning to the second tercet and also look at the fourth and fifth. Third, fourth, and fifth. Now the two sides of the wound part slowly like a mouth widening as it comes on the right word, or that neat tear in the half-obscured lower thigh. At the centre of the theatre in Eakin's The Gross Clinic, where, as I remember it, the owl-eyed surgeon seemed so unmoved by the thick scarlet globules that glistened like cheap lipstick on his thumb, and the anguish of Mother Berry's in her dress sleeve, as he explains precisely how he would poke a scalpel into tendon, muscle, bone to remove the latest clot of gangrene from the left leg of her son, who might, if all goes well, last out the year. The gaping or expressive wound on the hare's carcass is initially figured in terms of a performative speech act, but is then succeeded by a more considered comparison with the human body portrayed in Thomas Eakin's 1879 painting, The Gross Clinic. In short order, then, there's a triangulation of representational codes, with the oral and the visual enlisted here in the printed poetic form. This is Thomas Eakin's, if you're interested. He also has a more sanitized painting called the Agnew Clinic a number of years later in 1889. Yet the accumulated presences of such anthropocentric forms does not mean that the poem asserts any sense of species hierarchy, given that Berry characteristically leavens his lines with ambivalence. The poetic speaker recalls the Eacon's painting, but does so inconclusively, while the surgeon at the centre of the portrait describes his technical approach as akin to poking, which might aid the prospects of recovery in his patient. These are subtle hints at the diminution of outright control, a sense that is thrown further into relief with Berry's hackneyed use of simile, like cheap lipstick in the previous slide. This latter figure self-consciously lowers the tone, so to speak, deliberately registering as a failure of linguistic expression. It is not the right word alluded to in the second tercet. But there is also an imagistic symmetry evident in terms of the human patient and the encountered animal. Significant weight is given to physical suffering, fragmentation, and death, though neither is collapsed into the other with facile analogies. These intersections are not only addressed in the poem's attention to the sufferer, but Eacon's surgeon is metaphorized as a pitiless predator with spondaic, owl-eyed reference, though his apparent capacity for emotional and surgical intervention is not the sole registration of human emotion. The patient's mother furnishes the poem with an appropriately anguished, affective response, as Eakins captures the surgical violation of bodily integrity in a space of asymmetrical emotional conditions. Yet another note of ambivalence in the poem. In the protracted second sentence, Berry sketches out further details on Eacon's painting, noting that two assistants hold the patient down while a third and fourth with their crude tools keep open the incision and stare deep into the mysteries of the flesh, as eager for their time with the body as the petrel's kittiwake's black-headed gulls attend the hare's remains, up here in the near heaven of the dooms, all neck and beak and skirl as they uncoil the intestines turn by turn, divide liver from lung, pick out the heart, squabble over the kidneys. Berry's penchant for triplets is front and centre here, just as it appears in the earlier first sentence above, where he referred to tendon, muscle, and bone, that the poem rhetorically underscores the clamorous and visceral unpicking of the carcass. Most obviously, the lines strike a link between the physical exertions of the surgical assistants and the ways in which the birds hungrily dismember the carrion on the dunes. The violence of the former is not equated entirely with predation. However, given that the patient's suffering is potentially curative, but is certainly reasoned as contributory to deeper understanding of internal human anatomy. Violence then is inherent to survival across species, but is also informative, as we know, of anthropocentric epistemes. But there are also intimations here that sacrifice and suffering are shared across species. For instance, the devoured hare gives and prolongs life for the birds of prey, and this latter point, as we'll see, is alighted upon later in the poem. And just to return to the poem again to give you a bit of a breather. Right, so later in the poem, the deaths of the Keats brothers, John and Tom, and their TB cells, just for a bit of what would you call it, medical precision. Their deaths reintroduce illness and disease together with the ominous appearance and illness associated with blood. If the poem opened enlisting orality and visual art, it draws to a close by touching upon its own artistic genealogy, while also emphasizing the material mutualities of human and non-human species, as we just alluded to. But first, we read of John Keats' killing of blue tits, an act that sits comfortably with the earlier avian predation, but this outward exercise of violence then concedes ground on Keats' part to introspection on human mortality. He felt sure that the same blackness had claimed poor Tom, was sprouting in his lungs and would blossom. Anxiety and intuition dominate here rather than conclusive medical diagnosis. And the allusion to John Keats' imminent illness partakes of the ambivalence seen elsewhere in the form of the life-affirming idiom chosen to suggest the presence of fatal tubercular disease, blossom. And Keats' illness and death from tuberculosis speaks to the essential openness of the human body, underlying the fact that our somatic integrity is not impenetrable, but is entirely porous and permeable. Kind of commonplace argument in eco-criticism these days. In fact, the expressive orality that we saw in the widening mouth gestured to at the beginning of the poem is the same orifice through which bacterial spores enter the body and by which explicit symptoms of TB manifest. But as seen already, one form of death and decay enables other forms of life to prosper and to blossom. And these notions of viral and cellular traffic within and across species and organisms are attributed to Keats in the latter stages of his life. Keats feels sure that his remains would mean no more than a dropped apple to the worms the graveyard birds would yank out of the earth and swallow whole, that he and each of us would end up as coiled muscle in the wings of house sparrows, a dull throb in the robin's fragile heart, dissonance in the hoarse throat of the thrush. Again, we note the triplet here again, that these familiar birds are removed from the predatory varieties crowding the remains of the hare, yet their differences are inconsequential. The means by which they are nourished might not tally, but metabolization is common to all of the species, human and non-human, that are corralled in the poem. Keats' bodily remains too are vastly different from the carcass of which For the Birds opens, but there is commonality in their ultimate fates. Anxiety over mortality marks Keats' life and his poetic works, yet both live vibrantly into the future. If the body's organic porosity occasions his premature death, the poem resolves the same disease body can and will energize other life forms as it decays and dissolves into cellular matter. And again, to echo Jessica's talk, I'm going to refer to Deborah Bird-Rose, who emphasizes, and as Keats imagines, dense knots, or we are dense knots of embodied time, co-created and interdependent, even as our species differences are retained across deep time. For the Birds ends with an accommodation of the human and the non-human. The remains of the human persist in the living specimens that feed off the raw earth. Yet as the poem has repeatedly maintained, these relations are not without complication or difficulty. And this explains both the dullness and the dissonance of the final two lines. Tellingly, Berry deploys the alliterated words to evoke unease, or that key idea again, ambivalence, within the bodies of these birds, but specifically in relation to the oral effects of the physical functioning and capacities therein. The so-called dissonant notes of the thrush then speak back to the poem itself and its concern with the possibilities and ethics of representation. By way of conclusion then, this shows there's a measure, or it is a measure of the necessary anxiety that suffuses much eco-poetic representation, a self-reflexive leavening of any tendency to objectify, romanticize, or sentimentalize. As you've seen in Derry's work, there is an irresolution at the core of these linguistic and figurative assertions that is consistent with eco-critical cognizance of language's combined reductive complicity in the subjugation of an inability to do justice to the non-human world. Okay, thanks.
So, thank you very much for this presentation of this very intricate topic, which, despite of its sporadic focus on carcasses, diseases in bones, I can say probably we all really enjoyed. So thank you for this. And now is finally the time to basically let it all out what we've kept in this whole time. So it's time for the discussion. And I think we're running a bit late, but I think since we started late and also to get everything, we can like add 10 minutes or something till everything is answered by you two, and then you basically are questions about. So yeah, are there any questions? Both in the digital and in the physical room. And I see the very first one.
Yes, I've got one. Thank you for your talks that seem to be really very much in dialogue between enchanted encounters versus cold pastoral. I think that's the idea. And maybe my question is going into that direction. I'm really interested in a creation of a poetic lineage and the question of style and how can you actually write about animals, about encounters, about nature. And Jessica, you really expertly showed the intertextual connections. I also like the slide because they made it so visual. And I'm just asking myself, I'm asking you, you referred to Frost in the 20s, Bishop in the 40s, Ciaran in the 60s, and then of course Grennan. Would you say that all of those, that a poetic lineage is created by Grennan because all of those actually are neo-romantic ways or styles of writing? Or are there more subtle differences? And I'm asking because I think today we've got a heightened awareness, obviously, of climate change, of ecological problems. So the question is, would you then resort to romantic ways or neo-romantic ways of writing, or to cold pastoral, right? And how does this intertextual lineage work? How would you evaluate that? Is it a similar style throughout the ages or not? Is it romantic, enchanted, or I'm really interested in those issues.
Okay, well, I think it's actually quite interesting that you selected a poem where Keats is. There's the same sort of lineage that's happening. And as I was doing some thinking about also why he chose to bring in the poets that he did choose, of course, we have to remember that Grennan spent, I think, like 40, 50 years teaching in the US. So I can imagine why American poetics was quite, he probably was, very inspired by just being in a place where, of him being a poet who lived in two places, he is a kind of an embodiment of bringing poetics from one place to another, and also in his text. But in thinking about Paul Celan, he's quite a pessimist, obviously. So and so this quote, about the message in a bottle, it continues where I hope it will reach somebody on the heartland, but I'm not optimistic. So I want to say that certainly that you see poems that are selected to be brought in, and snippets of ones that maybe do have more of a romantic optimism, and others that don't. And yet still, I think particularly in the case of Paul Celan, who sort of suggests that a poem is like a handshake, and it's an exchange, and it's an act of giving attention to something, that I think that if one is engaged in that kind of intense attention, that it will be uplifting, even if it's only temporarily so. And I think maybe if I might say that, one thing that I find so gorgeous and attractive about these poems is the brevity of them. Grennan had done actually, some decades before this particular volume, works on the same hairs that are in long lines, very spacious. And I find them not as moving as these ones where he's really trying to enact in this box-like form something that's kind of lifting off. So he's sort of doing this thing, and maybe that's the thing is if I might end in this way, it's a hybrid between the grounded fashion that he tries to do this, but also, sort of this uplifting. So he's trying to maybe create a hybrid space. And I think that whole idea of the plainchant that feels narrow and yet rapid and expansive accomplishes that. So formally, it's, I think, quite effective to switch to this other typographic experience that he had when he was looking at some earlier same animal subjects that he had in other forms. Yeah.
I think obviously, you can see the link with Keats in the two poems I've looked at. There's another thing to say about Barry specifically. One is, like, you look across his work, like Eamon Grennan, he's in the States, he's teaching creative writing in the States. You can see the American influence in his work, like you can see elements of Art Crane and Walt Whitman and long lines and so on. The romantic side of it, I think, romanticism gets a fair bit of a kicking since eco-criticism. But you can't write nature poetry without considering it some kind of, it's probably a Freudian thing element there, isn't there? Kind of, but there's, and the other side of it, I think, is, we don't come to poetry. Well, they're an eco-critic poet. You don't come with, they don't write templates. So we come with reading strategies and all that sort of stuff. But there is no doubt that Ciaran Berry's background in Galway, in Donegal, suffuses work, and more than that, right? Those childhood memories. There's certainly a kind of romantic, I suppose, in a very general sense, critique of enlightenment. Now that's kind of pejorative, right? Say in terms of imperialism, certain naming and language. There's a self-consciousness about language, about form and shape, certainly, and there is, there is what you might call an eco-critical strain within it. Certainly, in the last poem, where he's obviously talking in terms that are demonstrably eco-critical about mutuality, about reseeding the earth, and all that sort of stuff. But there are probably ideas that were there before eco-criticism as well. yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are various influences in Barry's work. I think that, but I also think that if there are romantic influences in his work, they shouldn't be, you know, shown. And, you know, the idea of romance is not necessarily to kind of renovate it and redeem it in some sort of way, but I think there's a lot to be learned from it as well. You know, and at the early stage of Buddhism probably turned against it because of a sense of its objectifying strategies or whatever. Yeah, I mean, that's scattered on.
Thank you for your inputs and your question, of course. And there are numerous more. And we'll just go through the line, I think, starting with you, please.
Thank you, Jessica and Eóin, for a really great panel. Jessica, I wanted to pick up one of your wonderful terms, which was the idea of the swerve, and I really like this because it's a bodily verb, and it denotes a sensory reaction, I suppose, rather than being entirely linguistic. And I wanted to just invite you to expand a bit more on how you understand swerve, and you mentioned it came from Lucretius, and just to talk more about it, because I'd love to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, the thing was, I mean, it's sort of a recent find in the sense that I realized that many of the texts I had been reading had passages about the swerve in there that I had sort of read over, you know. And so when I went back and was thinking, okay, I'm going to go and try to do a little more careful analysis, it was popping up everywhere. And then I spoke actually with a friend in Prague who also does work on Irish poetry, and I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "I think that one of the reasons why this swerve is so attractive is partly because of its duality, in the sense that it's so good at bringing things together, things that maybe are disparate and apart, and so it feels like a wonderfully natural gesture that if we sort of see all the swerves, and I love that one quote the Führer has of some swerve upon swerve upon swerve, and the sort of the stacking experiences of them. It helps us, I think, particularly in poems that are like this of motion, where the speaker is moving, to really feel that bodily motion of pulling things into you, even as, very nicely, as Führer also says, things are moving away. So those movements that are forward and backward are also, I think, great in terms of border theory, of seeing the way that things are being ruptured and that bigger spaces are being created. And certainly there are so many tropes that are useful in thinking about this swerve. I didn't go into that here, but one could elaborate on everywhere the use of the simile in these poems is because it's a metaphor is that practice of pulling dissonant things together and suggesting they work here in this plane, these different domains, right? And so he uses so many strategies of various kinds of swerves, whether it is bringing in, of course, these companions, these non-human companions, poets into that space, use of metaphor, comparing a hare to an agile jet, so always these different domains that he brings in, I think, is another way of an enchantment that can kind of happen, because suddenly you realize you're in a much bigger space if one is only perceptive of it. So I love the gesture because it's open, it's expansive, and, as you say, very nicely, physical, and quite easy, I mean, it's great to hear that physicists also agree that it's true. So it's not only something that we in literary theory love, but it's so nice that it kind of bringing together, maybe thinking about the way that the sciences and poems can collaborate.
Can I just pick up, there's when you're talking there about the simile, and the swerve, there's a brilliant example of that and you mentioned the ode as well. In Ciaran Old's collection, Odes, she has an ode to the last 38 trees in New York City visible from this window. And in the first maybe 10 or 12 lines of that poem, she uses 5 or 6 similes to individualize the trees. And it's interesting that idea of the swerve, and she takes the ode, which is kind of taking a formal swerve into contemporary, because it's an out-of-date one anyway, but also using that accumulation of similes as well. So anyway, that's just an interesting kind of correlation.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to the next question.
Right, I know we're getting ready to leave, but I just wanted to bring up something about romanticism that I think is useful for this context. And I'm thinking of the distinction that Carolyn Merchant makes in The Depth of Nature between the organismic and the mechanistic view of the world, right? And that the romantics were really preserving an organismic living planet, I mean, that view of the world, as opposed to the rising kind of mechanistic worldview. So I really value them, and I see that coming through, Gary Snyder and Paula Meehan, who embrace and bring forward that preservation of the agency of the earth, right? So I think that that's one of the giant contributions that era gives us.
And you get the impression that the other thing is walking. That in a lot of Barry's poems about early parts of his life, things that he encounters could only have been encountered if he was out walking.
Right.
That sense of one place he finds an orchid, or it's out on the dunes. There's that element to the poetry as well, which is romantic, the idea of purposeful walking.
So thank you so much for this input. Next question, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about the adaptation of Ciaran for maybe interspecies communication. Your message in the bottle simile that Ciaran used is obviously, his kind of positive idea how in an age where usually his stance would be you can't speak in face of the unspeakable, so in face of post-Holocaust, there couldn't be any poetry and all that. And he would kind of a very vague hope that he has that there might be communication about pain, and if we can through language share pain, humans can somehow transcend their singular being into a new community. But that is very much language based. There is a vague hope, really a very vague hope that people might be able to speak to one another once again. And if you now translate that or adapt that to like human-animal relations, yeah, is there any horizon that we could actually speak to animals? Because if we adapt Ciaran, only language can create a kind of sharing of pain, which is otherwise unshareable. So does this poetry like just remain speaking about animals, or is there really this kind of attempt about a communication with animals that would be like the adaptation of Ciaran, but otherwise it's just kind of only half of Ciaran's poetry already exists.
Yeah, I mean, so Ciaran takes this idea from Josef Mandelstam, who also is certainly writing out of anguish and pain, and inability to really have your work exist in a space. I mean, I think about how his wife would visit him in prison, and he would recite a poem or give her, and she would have to eat it so that it could continue to exist. And so certainly this idea of how do words exist in crisis and in post-crisis contexts. I think the interesting poem that I ended with an ant literally walking across a Paul Celan poem is fascinating for him to sort of suggest here is this ant touching the language of Paul Celan, sort of this physicality of the words, the typographic experience, and yet he also is in poem after poem trying to do owling of also being a listener. So letting and as I also hope that there is that experience that I express that is of animals as makers as well. Now, of course, we might say this is sort of a project that is still pretty leaning in the poetic side, that he's bringing poets in and he's sort of, he's doing some witnessing, but he still is a maker himself, a poet of words in his poems, and therefore maybe is giving more weight to that kind of experience, although trying to invite in and create a space that's, even if it's still a page trying to read things where they're kind of coexisting and seen as kind of doubles. But I think there's actually one of the earlier poems where he mentions Ciaran is also where he's speaking about his own cancer. So we see this sort of cellular death. There's a lot of bleakness in this volume as well. We have the hairs that move across in various fashions, but sometimes they are discovered on walks as two dead hares. And so he sees their death as well. And how then he ends the volume with a hare that is in its own space, trying to find a kind of singing in the midst of a storm. So I think there is an acknowledgement of feeling of, either extinction, various crises that are in an ecological space, even if it ultimately is still, because he's so committed to epiphany, that there's some joy there. Yeah.
Okay. Is there also something you? Not.
I had it checked out there. Mossland or not my bailiwick at all.
Okay, so no problem. I mean, we're way over time anyway. So I'd like to wrap up this panel, if you don't have any more questions, by thanking you two for your wonderful. And yeah, you might know, we will meet again at 1 p.m. For our second panel, and during this time, of course, get re-energized, coffee with food, and we'll meet again.